happens when a fearless Viking maiden is forced to marry the most terrifying warrior of her time and discovers something no one could have predicted. You'll never guess what awaits her beyond the vows. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The frigid wind swept across the Norwegian fjords with a ferocity that matched the temperament of the warriors who called these lands home. It was the year 891, and the settlement of Eiríkstad stood as a testament to Viking resilience, its wooden longhouses huddled together against the relentless northern cold. Smoke rose from hearth fires, curling into the slate-gray sky where seabirds circled and cried their mournful songs. The settlement was carved into the mountainside, overlooking the dark waters of the fjord below, where longships bobbed gently at their moorings, their dragon-headed prows pointed toward distant horizons. Within the largest longhouse, tension hung as thick as the smoke from the central fire pit. Jarl Eirik Bloodaxe sat in his carved oak chair, his weathered face twisted in barely contained rage. His gray beard trembled as he glared at his daughter Astrid, who stood before him with her chin raised in defiance. At 19 winters, Astrid possessed a beauty that had drawn suitors from across the northern territories. Her hair fell in thick waves of honey gold past her waist, and her eyes were the pale blue of glacier ice. Her features were delicate yet strong, with high cheekbones and a full mouth that rarely smiled, but could cut with words as sharp as any blade. She wore a woolen dress of deep blue, embroidered at the collar and cuffs with intricate knotwork her mother had taught her before fever took her life 3 winters past. The Jarl's hands gripped the armrests of his chair until his knuckles turned white. The firelight cast dancing shadows across his face, emphasizing every line of anger etched there. Around them, the household thralls moved quietly, trying to make themselves invisible as the confrontation unfolded. The longhouse was adorned with shields hung on the walls, swords and axes displayed prominently, pelts of bear and wolf spread across the benches. The wealth of successful raids was evident in the silver arm rings the Jarl wore, in the fine tapestries that hung to keep out drafts, in the quality of the carved pillars that supported the roof. You refused him. Eric's voice was low, dangerous, like distant thunder promising a storm. You refused Thorgir Ironhand, a Jarl with lands 3 times the size of mine, ships that number 20, and warriors who would strengthen our alliance. Do you understand what you have done, girl? Astrid's spine remained rigid, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She had known this confrontation was inevitable from the moment she spoke the word that sealed her fate. I understand, father, that I cannot marry a man who reeks of ale from dawn until dusk, whose previous 2 wives died under suspicious circumstances, and who looks at women as if they were cattle to be bought and bred. The slap came so quickly that Astrid barely registered the movement before pain exploded across her cheek. She staggered but did not fall, would not give him that satisfaction. Her hand rose to her face, feeling the heat there, tasting blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her mouth. The thralls froze in their tasks, eyes downcast, knowing better than to acknowledge what they had witnessed. You dare speak to me of your preferences? Eric roared, rising from his chair. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered despite his 50 winters, and when he stood to his full height, he was an imposing figure. You are a woman, Astrid. Your purpose is to serve your family through alliance, to bear sons for whichever man I deem worthy of you. Your opinions, your desires, they matter not at all. Astrid felt tears prick her eyes but refused to let them fall. She had learned long ago that crying only fed her father's contempt. Since her mother's death, he had grown harder, colder, as if the loss had frozen whatever warmth he once possessed. She remembered a time when he would swing her onto his shoulders, when his laughter filled their home, when he looked at her mother with eyes full of love. That man was gone, replaced by this bitter Jarl who saw his daughter as nothing more than a commodity to trade. Mother would not have wanted this for me, Astrid said quietly, immediately regretting the words as she saw her father's face darken further. Your mother knew her place, Eric hissed. She understood duty, understood sacrifice. She would be ashamed of the willful, disobedient creature you have become. He circled her slowly, like a wolf stalking prey. But I know how to remedy this situation. If you will not accept an honorable match, if you choose to shame me before the other Jarls, then you will learn what it means to truly suffer the consequences of defiance. A cold dread settled in Astrid's stomach. She had expected punishment, perhaps confinement to the women's quarters, extra duties, even a beating. But something in her father's tone suggested he had contemplated something far worse. "Tomorrow you will be wed," Eric announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the longhouse. "Not to a jarl, not to a man of standing who might have treated you with some measure of respect despite your unworthiness. No, daughter mine, you will be married to Ragnar the Ruthless." The name fell like a stone into still water, the ripples of shock spreading through the household. Even the thralls could not hide their reactions, soft gasps and wide eyes betraying their horror. Astrid felt the blood drain from her face, felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her feet. Ragnar the Ruthless was a legend whispered about in fearful tones around fires, a name mothers invoked to frighten children into obedience. He was said to be a giant of a man, scarred beyond recognition, who had killed his first man at the age of 12 and had not stopped since. Stories claimed he had slaughtered entire families, burned villages to the ground, shown mercy to none who opposed him. He led a band of warriors known for their brutality, men who were shunned by other clans for their excessive violence, even in an age when violence was common currency. It was said that Ragnar had been exiled from his own lands for crimes so heinous that even his own father, a jarl of considerable power, had disowned him. "You cannot mean this," Astrid whispered, her defiance crumbling in the face of true terror. "Father, please. I will reconsider Thorgir. I will—" "Too late." Eric cut her off, satisfaction evident in his cruel smile. "The marriage contract is already prepared. Ragnar arrives at dawn with his men. You will be wed by midday, and by sunset you will leave with him to whatever frozen wasteland he calls home. Perhaps marriage to such a man will teach you the value of obedience, the importance of gratitude for the opportunities you so carelessly cast aside." Astrid's legs finally gave way, and she sank to her knees on the packed earth floor. The reality of her situation crashed over her like a wave. Marriage to Ragnar the Ruthless was tantamount to a death sentence, or perhaps something worse than death. The stories told of his wives, for there had been several, all of whom had disappeared after short, brutal marriages. Some said they fled into the wilderness, preferring death by exposure to life with such a monster. Others claimed darker fates. "Please," she found herself begging, hating the weakness in her voice, but unable to stop the words. "Father, I am your daughter, your only child, mother's daughter. Do not do this. I will marry whomever you choose. I swear it by all the gods." Eric looked down at her with cold eyes, any trace of paternal feeling buried beneath layers of wounded pride and anger. "You should have thought of that before you embarrassed me in front of Thorgir and his men, before you made me appear weak, unable to control my own household. This is your choice, Astrid, not mine. You have brought this upon yourself." He turned away from her then, dismissing her as he would a servant. "Take her to her chamber and see that she is guarded. She is not to leave until the ceremony tomorrow. If she attempts to flee, the guards have permission to restrain her by whatever means necessary." Two of her father's warriors, men she had known since childhood, approached with apologetic expressions. They helped her to her feet gently, more gently than they needed to, and she allowed herself to be led away. Her chamber was in the back of the longhouse, separated from the main hall by heavy curtains and a wooden partition. It was small, but had been made comfortable over the years, with furs piled on her sleeping bench, a chest containing her few possessions, a small loom where she worked on her weaving. The guards positioned themselves outside her doorway, and Astrid collapsed onto her furs, finally allowing the tears to come. They flowed hot and bitter down her cheeks as she buried her face in the soft pelts. Her whole body shook with the force of her sobs, grief and terror and rage all mixing together until she could not separate one emotion from another. How had her life come to this? She had always known she would marry for alliance rather than love. Such was the way of their people, the duty of daughters born to jarls and chieftains. But she had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that her father might find her a match with at least some promise of decent treatment, of mutual respect if not affection. She had dreamed sometimes of a husband who might value her opinions, who might see her as more than a vessel for sons and a keeper of his household. Instead, she was to be given to a monster, a man whose very name inspired fear, whose reputation was built on blood and suffering. Tomorrow she would speak vows that would bind her to him for life, and there would be no escape, no mercy, no hope. As the hours passed and the household settled into sleep, Astrid lay awake, staring at the shadows on the ceiling cast by the dying fire. She thought of running, of somehow slipping past the guards and fleeing into the night. But where would she go? A woman alone in the wilderness would not survive long, and any settlement she reached would return her to her father or worse. She had no allies, no resources, no skills that would sustain her in exile. She thought of ending her own life, of finding a blade and opening her veins before morning came. At least then she would die on her own terms, would escape the fate her father had decreed. But something in her, some stubborn core of will that had always defined her, rebelled against that solution. Why should she die for her father's cruelty, for a system that treated women as property to be traded and discarded? No, she decided as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the gaps in the walls. She would not run, and she would not die. She would face this marriage, face this warrior everyone feared, and she would find a way to survive. She had survived her mother's death, survived her father's transformation from loving parent to harsh tyrant. She would survive this too, somehow. The morning came too quickly, announced by the sounds of the settlement stirring to life, by the calls of roosters and the lowing of cattle, by the voices of thralls beginning their daily tasks. Astrid rose from her furs and washed her face in the basin of cold water, wincing as it stung her swollen eyes. She dressed carefully in her finest gown, a deep green wool that brought out the color of her eyes, fastening it with bronze brooches that had been her mother's. If she was to be married, she would at least look like the Jarl's daughter she was, would maintain her dignity, even as everything else was stripped from her. A thrall woman, old Gudrun, who had helped raise Astrid after her mother's death, entered with bread and cheese for breaking fast. The old woman's eyes were red-rimmed, and she embraced Astrid tightly without speaking. There were no words that could ease this situation, nothing to say that would not sound hollow and false. "Is there any word of what he looks like?" Astrid asked quietly as Gudrun helped her braid her hair. "Has anyone seen him arrive?" Gudrun's hands trembled slightly as she worked. "He came in the night, my lamb, him and 20 of his warriors. They camp outside the settlement walls. Your father sent me to tell you that the ceremony will proceed as planned, in the main hall before witnesses." "What does he look like?" Astrid pressed, needing to know, needing to prepare herself. The old woman was silent for so long that Astrid thought she would not answer. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Gudrun said, "I saw him from a distance when he arrived. He is very tall, taller than any man I have seen, broad as an oak tree. They say he is covered in battle scars, that his face is terrible to behold." Astrid closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe slowly, to maintain composure. She would not fall apart, not now, not when she needed all her strength. Too soon, the summons came. Her father's warriors escorted her to the main hall, which had been prepared for the ceremony. The fire pit blazed high and the witnesses had assembled, jarls and freemen from the settlement and surrounding areas. They watched her with expressions ranging from pity to contempt to barely concealed satisfaction at seeing the proud Astrid brought low. At the far end of the hall, near her father's chair, stood a group of warriors unlike any she had seen before. They were hard men, scarred and weathered, with eyes that held no warmth, no humanity. And among them, towering over even the tallest, stood a figure that made Astrid's breath catch in her throat. Ragnar the Ruthless was indeed a giant, standing easily a head taller than any other man present. His shoulders were impossibly broad beneath a heavy fur cloak, his arms thick with muscle that spoke of years wielding sword and axe. His dark hair was long and wild, braided with leather cords, his beard full and dark with streaks of gray. But it was his face that held her attention, that made her heart pound with something she could not quite name. The stories had spoken of terrible scars, of a visage nightmare-inducing and monstrous. And yes, there were scars, a prominent one cutting through his right eyebrow and another across his left cheekbone. But beneath the marks of battle was a face of surprising strength and harsh beauty. His features were chiseled and strong, his jaw square, his nose straight despite what must have been multiple breakings, and his eyes, pale gray like storm clouds, fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable, seen in a way she had never experienced. For a moment, just a heartbeat, something flickered in those gray eyes as he looked at her, something that might have been surprise or recognition, or perhaps pain. But it vanished so quickly that Astrid wondered if she had imagined it, replaced by the cold, hard expression of a man who felt nothing, cared for nothing beyond his own survival. The ceremony began with the ritual words spoken by the Gothi, the priest who served the settlement and officiated such occasions. His voice droned through the traditional invocations to the gods, asking for their blessing on this union, though Astrid wondered bitterly what blessings could possibly come from a marriage forged in punishment and spite. The smoke from the fire pit swirled upward, carrying with it the scent of burning pine and the herbs that had been cast into the flames for good fortune. Astrid stood rigid as a carved statue, her hands clasped before her to hide their trembling. She kept her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond Ragnar's shoulder, unable to meet those storm-gray eyes again, afraid of what she might see there, or what he might see in her own expression. Her father stood to the side, arms crossed over his chest, satisfaction evident in every line of his posture. He had made his point, demonstrated his authority, shown his daughter and everyone else what became of those who defied him. The Gothi called Ragnar forward to speak his vows, and the giant warrior moved with surprising grace for a man of his size. Each step was measured, controlled, the movement of someone accustomed to violence who had learned to master every aspect of his body. He wore no fine clothes for the occasion, just his worn leather and furs, his weapons belt with its array of knives, and a sword that looked as though it had tasted much blood. This, too, Astrid realized, was a statement. He cared nothing for ceremony, for tradition, for making any pretense that this was anything other than what it was. When Ragnar spoke, his voice was deep and rough, like stone grinding against stone. I, Ragnar Eriksson, take this woman as my wife according to the laws of our people. I will provide for her, protect her, and claim her as mine before all witnesses here assembled. The words were correct, the traditional vow, but spoken with such cold indifference that they felt more like a threat than a promise. There was no warmth in his tone, no indication that he felt anything at all about the woman he was binding himself to. Astrid felt something inside her grow even colder. A small flame of hope she had not realized she was nurturing finally guttering out. Then it was her turn. The Gothi gestured for her to step forward, to speak the words that would seal her fate. Her throat felt tight, her mouth dry, and for a moment she thought she might not be able to force the vow past her lips. But she had promised herself she would face this with dignity, and so she lifted her chin and met Ragnar's eyes directly for the first time since the ceremony began. I, Astrid Eiriksdottir, take this man as my husband according to the laws of our people, she said, her voice steady, despite the chaos of emotions roiling within her. I will keep his household, honor his name, and bind myself to him before all witnesses here assembled. Something shifted in Ragnar's expression as she spoke, so subtle that anyone not looking directly at him would have missed it. His eyes narrowed slightly, and one hand clenched briefly into a fist before relaxing again. But he said nothing, made no other acknowledgement of her words. The Gothi produced the ceremonial hammer, symbol of Thor, and held it between them as he spoke the final blessing. What is joined here before the gods and before this company, let no man put asunder. You are bound now, husband and wife, until death parts you. Until death parts you. The words echoed in Astrid's mind with grim finality. How long would that be, she wondered? How long before she became another disappeared wife? Another story whispered in fearful tones. Her father stepped forward then, offering the ceremonial cup of mead that the bride and groom would share to seal their union. Ragnar took it first, drinking deeply without ceremony, then handed it to Astrid. She accepted it with hands that shook only slightly, proud of that small victory over her fear, and drank. The mead was sweet and strong, warming her throat as it went down, a pleasant sensation that felt incongruous with the circumstances. It is done, Eric announced, his voice carrying satisfaction. My daughter is your wife now, Ragnar Eriksson. May this alliance serve us both well. Alliance. Astrid wanted to laugh at the word. What alliance could there be between her father and a man he clearly viewed with contempt? A man he had chosen specifically because wedding his daughter to him was the worst punishment he could devise? But Ragnar merely nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head that acknowledged the Jarl's words without agreeing or disagreeing. The witnesses began to disperse, some heading to the tables that had been laden with food and drink for the wedding feast. It would be a subdued celebration, nothing like the days-long festivities that typically accompanied a Jarl's daughter's marriage, just enough to satisfy tradition, to say that proper custom had been observed. Ragnar turned to Astrid for the first time since the vows had been spoken. Up close, he was even more imposing, his height and breadth making her feel small and fragile despite her own above-average stature. The scars on his face were more visible now, pale lines against his tanned skin, evidence of a life lived in constant battle. But again, she was struck by the realization that he was not the monster of legend, not physically at least. His features were strong and well-formed, his eyes intelligent despite their coldness. "Come," he said simply, the single word a command rather than a request. "We leave within the hour." Astrid blinked in surprise. "Within the hour? But the feast? I have no interest in your father's hospitality or his food." Ragnar cut her off, his tone brooking no argument. "Gather whatever possessions you wish to bring. One chest, no more. My men are preparing to depart." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the hall. The abruptness of it stung, though she could not say why. What had she expected? Courtesy? Consideration? From a man called the Ruthless? Gudrun appeared at her elbow, the old woman's face creased with worry. "Come, child. Let us pack your things quickly. It seems your husband is eager to be away from here." They returned to Astrid's chamber, where Gudrun helped her select what items to bring. Her finest dresses, though she had few. The jewelry her mother had left her. Not much, but precious nonetheless. Her sewing supplies, some personal items. The chest filled quickly, and Astrid found herself looking around the small room that had been hers since childhood, knowing she would never see it again. "Will you be all right, my lamb?" Gudrun asked softly, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I wish I could go with you, help you in whatever place you are going." Astrid embraced the old woman tightly. "You have your own family here, your grandchildren. Do not worry for me, Gudrun. I will find a way to survive. I always have." But as she said the words, she wondered if she truly believed them. Surviving her mother's death, surviving her father's coldness, those had been challenges she faced in familiar surroundings with at least some small support. Now she was venturing into the unknown with a man whose reputation was built on violence and whose eyes held no promise of kindness. Too soon, one of Ragnar's warriors appeared at the doorway. He was a grizzled man with a scar bisecting his lips, giving his face a permanent sneer. "The chief says it is time. Bring the chest." Astrid lifted her chin, called on every bit of pride and strength she possessed, and followed the warrior out into the settlement's main yard. Ragnar's men had indeed prepared to leave, their horses saddled, supplies packed. She had expected to walk or perhaps ride in a cart, but to her surprise, Ragnar stood beside a beautiful mare, dappled gray with intelligent eyes. "You will ride," he said, gesturing to the horse. "We move quickly, and I will not slow the company for a woman on foot." It was not kindness, Astrid realized, but practicality. Still, she was grateful. She had learned to ride as a child, before her father decided such pursuits were unsuitable for a daughter, and she had missed it. The warrior who had fetched her lifted her chest onto one of the pack horses, securing it with practiced efficiency. Ragnar mounted his own horse, a massive black stallion that suited his size and temperament. He looked down at her with those unreadable gray eyes. "Keep pace. If you fall behind, we will not stop for you." Then he wheeled his horse and led his men toward the settlement gates. Astrid quickly mounted her mare, her movements perhaps not as smooth as they once were, but competent enough. She glanced back once at the longhouse where she had been born, where her mother had died, where her father watched from the doorway with no expression of regret or sorrow. Then she turned forward and followed her new husband into an uncertain future. They rode for hours through the Norwegian wilderness, following paths that wound through dense forests of pine and birch, across streams swollen with snowmelt, over rocky terrain that tested both horse and rider. Ragnar set a punishing pace, and Astrid gritted her teeth and matched it, refusing to show weakness or complain. The other warriors, 20 in total, rode in formation around them, ever watchful for threats both human and animal. No one spoke to her. The men occasionally called to each other, brief exchanges about the path or potential dangers, but they treated Astrid as if she were invisible, a piece of cargo to be transported, but not acknowledged. She told herself she preferred it this way, that their indifference was better than hostility or unwanted attention. But the isolation gnawed at her, made the journey feel even longer. The landscape changed as they traveled, becoming more rugged and remote. They passed abandoned settlements, evidence of raids, or simply the harsh realities of survival in these lands. They saw no other travelers, no signs of human habitation. It was as if they were riding into a wilderness untouched by civilization, and perhaps that was exactly what they were doing. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Ragnar finally called a halt. They had reached a clearing near a stream, sheltered on three sides by rock formations that would provide some protection from the wind. The warriors dismounted with practiced efficiency, immediately beginning to set up camp, tending to the horses, gathering firewood, establishing a perimeter. Astrid slid from her mare's back, her legs trembling from the long hours of riding. She had not ridden so far or so hard in years, and her body protested every movement. But she forced herself to stand straight, to lead her horse to the stream for water as the warriors were doing, to begin unsaddling the mare, though her fingers fumbled with the unfamiliar straps and buckles. "You are doing it wrong," a voice said behind her, and she turned to find one of the younger warriors watching her. He had kind eyes, unusual in this company, and a fresh scar across his forehead that spoke of a recent battle. "Here, let me show you." He demonstrated the proper way to remove the saddle and tack, speaking quietly, patiently. "I am Bjorn," he offered. "Bjorn Torsen. I have served Ragnar for 3 years now." "Thank you, Bjorn," Astrid said, grateful for even this small kindness. "I am Astrid, though I suppose you know that." Bjorn nodded, then glanced over his shoulder to where Ragnar stood speaking with several of his men. "He is not as the stories say," the young warrior said quietly. "The chief, I mean. Yes, he is fierce in battle, ruthless to his enemies, but to those who serve him loyally, to those under his protection, he is fair. He has never harmed a woman or child, never broken an oath, never abandoned his men." Before Astrid could respond, another warrior called Bjorn away, and she was left alone with her thoughts. She finished caring for her horse as best she could, then stood uncertainly, unsure where she was meant to go or what she was meant to do. The warriors had erected a single tent, larger than the others, which she assumed must be for Ragnar. For them, she realized with a cold stab of dread. This was their wedding night, and whatever came next, she would have to face it. A fire had been built in the center of the camp, and the warriors gathered around it, passing dried meat and hard bread, sharing a skin of mead. Astrid approached slowly, and one of the men wordlessly handed her a portion of food. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing, her stomach too tight with anxiety to properly register hunger. Ragnar sat slightly apart from his men, his back against a rock, his eyes scanning the darkening forest around them. He had not looked at her once since they had made camp, had not spoken to her or acknowledged her presence. It was as if she did not exist to him, as if he had already forgotten the vows spoken mere hours ago. As full darkness fell and the stars emerged in the clear sky above, the warriors began to settle for the night. Some took positions around the perimeter to keep watch, while others wrapped themselves in their cloaks and furs, preparing to sleep. Astrid remained by the fire, unsure, until Ragnar finally stood and walked toward the tent he had erected. He paused at the entrance and looked back at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "Come," he said, the same command he had given her in the hall after the ceremony. Astrid's heart began to pound so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment when she would learn exactly what kind of monster she had been bound to. She forced her legs to move, forced herself to follow him into the tent. Inside, a single oil lamp provided dim illumination. Furs had been spread on the ground to create a sleeping space, and her chest sat in one corner. Ragnar stood in the center of the space, his head nearly touching the tent's roof, and for the first time, she saw something other than cold indifference in his expression. He looked tired, she realized, bone-weary in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. Ragnar stood motionless in the center of the tent, his massive frame casting long shadows that danced across the walls in the lamplight. Astrid remained near the entrance, every muscle in her body tense, prepared for whatever might come. The silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the distant sounds of the camp settling for the night and the crackling of the fire outside. Finally, Ragnar spoke, his voice low and rough. "You will sleep there," he said, gesturing to one side of the furs. I will sleep here. He indicated the opposite side, a clear space between where he pointed. I will not touch you. Astrid stared at him, certain she had misheard. What? I said I will not touch you, Ragnar repeated, his tone carrying a hint of impatience. He began removing his weapon belt, setting it carefully within reach. Your father may have forced this marriage, but I am not the monster he believes me to be. I do not force women, not in battle and not in marriage. The relief that flooded through Astrid was so intense, it made her knees weak. She had been bracing herself for violence, for pain, for the brutal taking that she had assumed was inevitable. But even as relief came, confusion followed quickly after. I do not understand. We are married. You have every right. Rights, Ragnar interrupted, his voice bitter. Yes, by law and custom, I have the right to claim you as my wife in every way. But rights and what a man chooses to do with them are different things. He sat down on his side of the furs, beginning to remove his boots. You were forced into this marriage as punishment. I will not compound that punishment by forcing myself upon you. Astrid slowly moved further into the tent, her mind racing to make sense of this unexpected turn. Everything she had heard about Ragnar the Ruthless, every story and rumor, painted him as a man of excessive violence, someone who took what he wanted without care for others. Yet here he was, on their wedding night, offering her a mercy she had not dared to hope for. Why? She asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. Why would you agree to this marriage at all? My father clearly meant it as an insult to us both, pairing his disobedient daughter with a man he considers beneath his notice. What could you possibly gain from such an arrangement? Ragnar was silent for a long moment, his hands stilling on the laces of his second boot. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, careful. Your father came to me 3 days ago with an offer. He said his daughter had refused an advantageous match and needed to learn obedience. He offered me silver, supplies for my men, and safe passage through his territories in exchange for taking you off his hands. He pulled off the boot and set it aside. I needed the supplies. My men and I have been living on the edges of civilization for 2 years, ever since I was exiled from my father's lands. The silver will buy us food and weapons for the coming winter, and the safe passage means we can travel to the coast without fear of ambush. So I am a transaction, Astrid said quietly, something painful twisting in her chest, despite knowing she should feel nothing for this stranger. A means to an end. We are all transactions of one kind or another, Ragnar replied, finally looking at her directly. In the lamplight, his gray eyes seemed almost silver, and there was something in them that might have been regret, or perhaps just weariness. You were a transaction for your father, a tool to build alliances, or, when you failed to serve that purpose, a way to demonstrate his authority. At least with me, you know exactly what the exchange entails. I needed resources to keep my men alive. You needed escape from a father who would have married you to worse than me given the chance. Worse than you? Astrid could not keep the skepticism from her voice. You are called the Ruthless. The stories say you have killed hundreds, that you show no mercy, that your previous wives all disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Something flickered across Ragnar's face, gone too quickly to identify. Stories are rarely the full truth. Yes, I have killed many men, but all of them in battle or in defense of my life and the lives of my men. As for my wives, he paused, and for the first time, Astrid heard genuine emotion in his voice, a deep pain that he quickly buried. I have been married once before when I was young and still lived in my father's hall. Her name was Ingrid. She died giving birth to our son, who lived only 3 days. I have not remarried since, despite what the rumors might claim. Astrid felt the ground shift beneath her understanding. One wife, not many. Dead in childbirth, a tragedy common enough, but no less devastating for its frequency. She studied Ragnar's face, seeing past the scars and the harsh lines to the grief that lingered there, carefully hidden but present nonetheless. I am sorry for your loss, she said softly, meaning it. Losing a wife and child, that is a pain I cannot imagine. Ragnar's jaw tightened. It was 8 years ago. The pain has dulled, but it does not disappear. He lay back on the furs, staring up at the tent's ceiling. Sleep, Astrid. We have many more hours of travel tomorrow, and I will not slow the pace for exhaustion. Astrid hesitated, then moved to her side of the sleeping space. She lay down carefully, keeping as much distance between them as the tent's confines allowed. She was still fully dressed, having no nightclothes and no intention of removing her garments in any case. The furs were warm beneath her, far more comfortable than she had expected, and despite everything, her exhausted body began to relax. "Why are you called the Ruthless?" she asked into the darkness, unable to stop her curiosity. "If you are not the monster the stories claim, where did the name come from?" Ragnar was silent for so long that she thought he would not answer. Then his voice came low and rough. 5 years ago, a rival Jarl attacked a settlement under my father's protection while my father was away. The Jarl and his men slaughtered the warriors, burned the buildings, and took the women and children as thralls. I was leading a group of my father's men on patrol when we received word. We tracked them for 3 days and nights without rest, without food, driven by rage at what they had done. He paused, and Astrid heard him take a deep breath. When we caught them, I showed no mercy. Every man who had participated in that raid, I killed, not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly, making sure they suffered as their victims had suffered. I freed the women and children and sent them home, but the story of what I had done spread, how I had been ruthless in my vengeance, how I had tortured my enemies before killing them. The name stuck, and the story grew with each retelling until I became a legend of cruelty rather than a man seeking justice for innocence. Astrid absorbed this, her mind working to reconcile the image she had built with this new information. But why were you exiled from your father's lands? What could cause a father to disown his son? Another long silence. When Ragnar spoke again, his voice was heavy with old bitterness. My father remarried after my mother died. His new wife, Helga, was young and ambitious. She gave him 3 sons in quick succession, and with each birth my position became more precarious. I was the eldest, but I was also a reminder of his first wife, a complication to Helga's plans for her own children's advancement. He shifted on the furs, and Astrid could sense the tension in his body despite the darkness between them. 2 years ago, gold went missing from my father's treasury. Helga claimed she saw me near the treasury room, implied I had taken it to fund some scheme of my own. She had planted evidence, convinced several thralls to speak against me. My father, besotted with his young wife and eager to please her, chose to believe her lies over my truth. He gave me a choice: trial by combat, where I would likely have to kill my own half-brothers who Helga had convinced to champion against me, or exile with my life and whatever men chose to follow me. You chose exile, Astrid said softly. I chose not to kill boys who were innocent pawns in their mother's game. Ragnar corrected. My half-brothers were children, the eldest barely 14 winters. What honor is there in cutting down children to prove a point? So I left, took the 20 men who remained loyal to me, and we have been wandering since, hiring our swords where we can, taking what we need when we must. The story painted a different picture than the one Astrid had been carrying. Not a monster, but a man who had been betrayed by his family, who had made hard choices to preserve what honor he could. A man who had lost his wife and child, his home, his position, everything that defined him, and yet had maintained enough principle to refuse the easy path of violence against the innocent. Thank you, Astrid said into the darkness, for telling me, for being honest about the circumstances of our marriage, for, she hesitated, then forced herself to continue, for not forcing yourself upon me tonight. Do not thank me for basic decency, Ragnar replied gruffly. Any man who would force a woman deserves neither respect nor gratitude for choosing not to commit such an act. He rolled onto his side, his back to her. Now sleep. Tomorrow will be long, and the days after longer still. Astrid closed her eyes, but sleep did not come easily. Her mind turned over everything she had learned, everything that had happened since dawn. Her life had changed irrevocably in the span of hours, but perhaps not entirely in the way she had feared. She was married to a stranger, yes, bound to a man whose reputation was fearsome and whose future was uncertain. But he had shown her an unexpected kindness, a consideration she had not received from her own father. As exhaustion finally began to pull her under, Astrid found herself thinking that perhaps survival might be possible after all. Perhaps in time she might even find something more than mere survival in this strange new life she had been thrust into. The days that followed established a pattern. They would rise before dawn, break camp with swift efficiency, and ride for hours through increasingly wild and remote territory. The landscape changed from the forests and fjords of her homeland to rockier, more barren terrain, mountains rising in jagged peaks around them, valleys carved by ancient glaciers stretching before them. The weather grew colder, the wind more biting, and Astrid was grateful for the thick furs and wool clothing she had brought. Ragnar remained distant but not unkind. He ensured she had adequate food and water, that her horse was well tended, that she had what she needed to maintain basic comfort. But he did not speak to her beyond practical necessities, did not seek her company or conversation. At night, they shared the tent in the same careful arrangement, each keeping to their own side, the space between them an invisible but carefully maintained boundary. The other warriors gradually became less invisible to Astrid. Bjorn, who had first shown her kindness, often rode near her during the day, occasionally pointing out landmarks or explaining where they were headed. From him, she learned they were traveling to a remote valley in the mountains where Ragnar had established a small settlement, a place of refuge for his exiled band. "It is not much," Bjorn told her on the 4th day of travel, "but it is ours. We have built longhouses, established defenses, started farming the land. We survive through hunting, through trading with the few settlements willing to deal with us, through occasional raids on those who would threaten us. It is a hard life, but it is honest, and we owe allegiance to no jarl who might betray us on a whim." Astrid appreciated his openness, the way he treated her as a person rather than an unwanted burden. Through Bjorn, she began to learn about the other men. There was Orm, the grizzled warrior with the scarred lip who had first summoned her from her chamber, who served as Ragnar's second-in-command. There was young Eric, barely 17, who had followed his older brother into exile, and who still had the enthusiasm of youth despite the harshness of their circumstances. There was Torsten, quiet and serious, who had been a shipbuilder before joining Ragnar's band and who now crafted their weapons and tools. Each man had a story, Astrid discovered. Each had chosen to follow Ragnar into exile for their own reasons, whether loyalty or honor or simply lack of better options. And each seemed to regard their leader with a respect that went beyond fear, a devotion that spoke to Ragnar's treatment of those under his protection. On the 7th day of travel, they crested a mountain pass, and Astrid saw their destination spread out in the valley below. It was indeed remote, surrounded on 3 sides by steep mountains and accessible only through the narrow pass they had just traversed. In the valley's center, nestled beside a lake of crystalline blue water, stood several longhouses and numerous smaller buildings. Smoke rose from hearth fires, and Astrid could see small figures moving between the structures, could make out cultivated fields and animal pens, the evidence of a community working to establish itself. "Home," Ragnar said, speaking to her directly for the first time in days. He had reined in his horse beside hers, and when Astrid looked at him, she saw something in his expression that might have been pride or perhaps apprehension. "It is not what you are accustomed to, I am sure. Nothing like your father's settlement with its wealth and comforts. But it is ours, built by our own hands, defended by our own strength." Astrid studied the settlement below, her sharp eyes taking in details. The longhouses were well constructed, their roofs thatched with care, their walls solid and straight. The fields were organized efficiently, the animal pens sturdy. This was no ramshackle camp of desperate men, but rather a genuine attempt to build something lasting, something worthy. "It looks like a good place," she said honestly. "A place where people could build a life." Something shifted in Ragnar's expression, a slight softening around his eyes. "That is what we are trying to do. Build lives worth living, even if the rest of the world has cast us out." He urged his horse forward, beginning the descent into the valley. "Come, you will meet the others." As they rode down into the settlement, people began to emerge from the buildings to watch their approach. Astrid saw women among them, children too, not just warriors. A small community, perhaps 50 people in total, all stopping their work to observe the returning party and the stranger who rode with them. They stopped in the central area between the largest longhouse and what appeared to be a communal hall. Ragnar dismounted and immediately was surrounded by people asking questions, reporting on what had happened in his absence, seeking his attention and guidance. He handled it all with calm efficiency, giving orders, answering questions, making decisions with the confidence of a man accustomed to leadership. Astrid remained on her horse, uncertain and suddenly overwhelmed. This was to be her home now, these people her community, and she knew no one, understood nothing of how life functioned here. She felt the eyes on her, assessing, judging, wondering who she was and what her presence meant. A woman stepped forward from the crowd, and Astrid felt her breath catch. She was perhaps 30 winters, with auburn hair braided intricately and woven with colored thread, her face strong and beautiful despite a scar that ran from her temple to her jawline. She wore practical clothing, a dark blue dress with an apron, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who held authority in this place. Her green eyes swept over Astrid with an assessment that felt neither hostile nor welcoming, simply thorough. "So this is the bride," the woman said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. She looked to Ragnar, one eyebrow raised. "You said nothing of bringing back a wife when you left, Ragnar. This is unexpected." Ragnar's jaw tightened slightly, the only sign of discomfort Astrid had seen him display. "The circumstances were unexpected for all involved, Freya. This is Astrid Eiriksdottir, daughter of Jarl Eirik Bloodaxe. We were married 7 days ago." He gestured toward the woman. "Astrid, this is Freya. She manages the household affairs here, oversees the women's work, and keeps this settlement functioning when I am away." Freya stepped closer to Astrid's horse, her gaze never wavering. "Can you work, girl? Or are you one of those Jarl's daughters who has done nothing but sit at a loom all her life while thralls do the real labor?" The challenge in Freya's tone was clear, and Astrid understood immediately that her acceptance here would depend on how she answered. She met the woman's eyes directly, lifting her chin. "I can work, I can weave, sew, cook, tend animals, and manage a household. My mother taught me before she died that a woman's value is not in her birth but in what she contributes. I may be a Jarl's daughter, but I am not useless." A flicker of approval crossed Freya's scarred face. "We will see. Dismount. I will show you where you will live and what will be expected of you." She glanced at Ragnar. "Unless you have other plans for your bride." Ragnar shook his head. "Show her the settlement. Introduce her to the women. Help her find her place here. I have matters to attend to." He walked away without another word to Astrid, already deep in conversation with Orm about something that had occurred during his absence. Astrid dismounted, her legs stiff from the long day's ride, and found herself standing before Freya with the rest of the settlement watching with undisguised curiosity. The woman looked her up and down once more, then nodded sharply. "Come, bring your chest. The boys will tend to your horse." 2 young boys, perhaps 10 and 12 winters, eagerly came forward to take the mare's reins, leading her toward what appeared to be stables. Another man retrieved Astrid's chest from the pack horse, carrying it as he followed Freya and Astrid toward the largest longhouse. Inside, the longhouse was spacious and well-maintained. The central hearth fire burned steadily, providing warmth and light. The walls were hung with weapons, shields, and tapestries depicting battles and hunting scenes. Sleeping benches lined the sides, separated by carved wooden partitions for privacy. It was clear this was Ragnar's hall, the center of his authority in this settlement. Freya led Astrid to a partitioned area near the back of the longhouse, separated from the main hall but still part of the same structure. It was a private chamber, larger than the one Astrid had occupied in her father's house, with a proper bed frame piled with furs, a chest for storage, hooks on the walls for clothing, and even a small table with a bronze mirror. "This is Ragnar's chamber," Freya said, watching Astrid's face carefully. "Yours now as well, I suppose, as his wife, though he has slept here alone since Ingrid died 8 years ago." She paused, and something in her expression softened slightly. "He told us of her then, of Ingrid and the babe." Astrid nodded. "He did. On our wedding night, he explained why the stories about multiple wives were false." "Good," Freya said, and there was approval in her tone now. "Ragnar is a private man, slow to trust, slower still to share his pain. If he told you of Ingrid, it means something." She gestured for the man carrying the chest to set it down, then dismissed him with a nod. Once they were alone, Freya's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming less formal. "I will speak plainly with you, Astrid Eirik's daughter, because I think you can handle plain speaking." "Please," Astrid said, grateful for honesty after days of uncertainty. "Ragnar is a good man in a world that has not been good to him," Freya began, her voice low and intense. He leads these people with fairness and strength, treats those under his protection with honor, and has never once abused the power he holds. But he is also damaged, broken in ways that 8 years have not fully healed. He loved Ingrid deeply, and her death, the death of their son, it changed him, made him colder, more distant, afraid to feel too much because feeling means pain. Astrid listened intently, understanding that this woman was offering her something valuable, insight into the man she had married. He told me he would not force himself upon me, that he would not compound the punishment of this forced marriage. Freya's eyes widened slightly in surprise, then she nodded slowly. That sounds like him. Honorable to a fault, even when it costs him. She moved to the chamber's entrance, looking out at the longhouse beyond. I was Ingrid's closest friend. I held her hand as she died, held the babe those 3 days he lived. I watched what it did to Ragnar, how it nearly destroyed him. He threw himself into battle after that, took risks no sane man would take, as if he were seeking death, but could not quite bring himself to claim it directly. What changed? Astrid asked softly. His father's betrayal, Freya answered. When he was exiled, forced to leave everything he had known, he suddenly had purpose again. These men, this settlement, it gave him something to protect, something to build. He poured all that grief and rage into creating this place, into keeping his people safe and fed, but he has not allowed himself to truly live, not really. He exists, he leads, he survives, but he does not live. Astrid moved to sit on the edge of the bed, processing this information. Why are you telling me this? Freya turned to face her fully. Because you are his wife now, whether either of you wanted it or not. And I think, perhaps, you might be good for him, if you are strong enough, patient enough. But I also want you to understand what you face, what he faces. This will not be an easy marriage. Even without the physical demands he has chosen to spare you. I never expected easy, Astrid said quietly. My father made certain of that when he chose this punishment. Your father is a fool, Freya said bluntly. He thought he was punishing you by marrying you to the fearsome Ragnar the Ruthless. But Ragnar, for all his scars and reputation, is a better man than most jarls who sit in comfortable halls and speak of honor they do not possess. Your father may have inadvertently done you a kindness, though I doubt he will ever know it. Over the following days, Astrid began to find her place in the settlement. Freya introduced her to the other women, a mix of wives, sisters, and daughters of Ragnar's warriors, along with several women who had come to the settlement seeking refuge from various circumstances. There was Hilda, a widow whose husband had died in the same battle that had led to Ragnar's exile, who now managed the weaving and textile work. There was young Sina, barely 15, who had fled an abusive father and found sanctuary here. There was Thora, a healer with knowledge of herbs and medicine, whose skills had saved more than one warrior's life. Each woman had her role, her contribution to the community's survival, and they worked together with an efficiency born of necessity. There was no room for idleness here, no thralls to do the heavy work. Everyone contributed, from the youngest child to the eldest grandmother. Astrid threw herself into the work with determination. She helped prepare meals in the communal kitchen, ground grain for bread, tended the vegetable gardens that provided food for the winter stores. Her hands, soft from relative privilege, quickly developed calluses and small cuts from unfamiliar labor. Her back ached from bending over washtubs and grinding stones, but she did not complain, did not ask for special treatment, and slowly, grudgingly, she began to earn the respect of the other women. Ragnar remained distant. She saw him daily, of course, at meals in the Great Hall, or passing through the settlement as he oversaw various projects and training exercises with his men. But he did not seek her out, did not speak to her beyond brief exchanges of necessity. At night he would enter their shared chamber late, after she was already asleep or pretending to be, and would leave before dawn. They maintained their careful arrangement, sharing space but nothing else. Two strangers bound by vows but separated by walls, neither seemed willing or able to breach. 3 weeks after her arrival, the settlement faced its first crisis since Astrid had come. A hunting party returned with news of tracks, evidence that a large group of armed men was moving through the mountains, possibly heading toward their valley. Ragnar immediately called a council of his senior warriors, and Astrid watched from the sidelines as they debated the threat. Could be raiders, Orm said, his scarred face grim. Could be bounty hunters sent by someone who wants Ragnar's head. Could be your father's men, he added, glancing at Astrid, coming to take back his daughter or ensure the marriage alliance is being honored. Ragnar's expression was unreadable. We prepare for the worst and hope for the best. Double the watch, ensure all weapons are ready, bring the livestock closer to the settlement. If they are merely passing through, we will let them go in peace. If they come with hostile intent, we will defend what is ours. The settlement transformed overnight into a fortress. The men drilled with weapons, checked and rechecked defenses, established plans for protecting the women and children if battle came. The women prepared supplies, tended to armor and weapons, made ready to care for wounded if necessary. Astrid found herself working alongside Thora in the healer's house, learning which herbs could stop bleeding, which could fight infection, which could ease pain. The work was absorbing, required complete focus, and Astrid was grateful for the distraction from her anxiety about the approaching threat. On the second day of preparation, as she was grinding willow bark for pain remedy, Ragnar entered the healer's house. His presence filled the small space, and both Thora and Astrid looked up in surprise. The healer quickly excused herself, leaving them alone, and Astrid felt her heart begin to pound. "You do not need to be here," Ragnar said without preamble. "If fighting comes, Thora and her assistants will handle the wounded. You should be with the other women in the safest part of the settlement." Astrid set down her grinding stone and met his eyes. "I am capable of helping. Thora says I have steady hands and a strong stomach. If men are wounded defending this settlement, defending me, then I will do what I can to help save them." Something flickered in Ragnar's gray eyes, an emotion too quick to identify. "This is not your fight, Astrid. You did not choose to be here, did not choose this life. I will not ask you to risk yourself for it. You are not asking," Astrid replied firmly. "I am offering. This may not have been my choice, but it is my life now. These people have accepted me, taught me, included me. I will not hide while they face danger." Ragnar was silent for a long moment, studying her face as if seeing her for the first time. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "You are stronger than I expected, braver than you should need to be." "I am my mother's daughter," Astrid said quietly. "She taught me that strength is not just in the sword arm, but in the will to stand firm when everything inside you wants to run. She taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it." "Your mother was wise," Ragnar said. He moved closer, close enough that Astrid could see the details of the scars on his face, could see the exhaustion in his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. "I have not been fair to you these past weeks. I have kept you at distance, treated you as an obligation rather than a person. That was wrong of me." Astrid felt her breath catch at Ragnar's unexpected admission. In the 3 weeks since their marriage, he had maintained such careful distance, such rigid formality, that she had begun to accept it as the permanent nature of their relationship. Now, standing in the dim light of the healer's house with the scent of herbs heavy in the air, he was offering something different, something more human than the cold courtesy that had defined their interactions. "You have treated me with more consideration than my own father did," Astrid said honestly. "You have given me safety, shelter, and the freedom to find my place here, without demands or cruelty. That is more than I dared hope for when I spoke those vows." Ragnar's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the scarred skin. "Basic decency is not something you should have to be grateful for. It should be the foundation, not the ceiling of expectation." He looked away, his gaze moving to the shelves lined with clay pots and bundles of dried herbs. "I know what it is to be trapped in circumstances beyond your control, to have your life dictated by the ambitions and angers of others. I swore after my exile that I would never be the cause of such suffering for another person. Yet you agreed to marry me," Astrid pointed out gently, "knowing my father meant it as punishment, knowing I had no choice in the matter." "I did," Ragnar acknowledged, turning back to face her. "And I have wrestled with that decision every day since. I told myself I was doing it for practical reasons, for the supplies and safe passage my men needed. But if I am honest, there was a part of me that thought perhaps I could offer you something better than what your father had planned. Thorgir Ironhand has a reputation for cruelty to his wives. Your father would have known that when he arranged the match. At least with me, you would be safe from that particular kind of harm." Astrid studied his face. seeing the conflict written in the lines around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. "You were trying to save me," she said slowly, understanding dawning. "Even as you told yourself you were being practical, you were trying to offer a better alternative. I failed at that too," Ragnar said bitterly. "I have kept you at such distance that you might as well be a stranger living in my house. I sleep in the same chamber, and yet we barely speak. That is no life for anyone, let alone a woman who has already suffered enough at the hands of a father who should have protected her." Before Astrid could respond, the door to the healer's house burst open, and Bjorn appeared, breathing hard from running. "Chief, they are here. The armed party we spotted. They are approaching the pass, maybe 20 men, flying no banner we recognize." Ragnar's entire demeanor shifted instantly, the vulnerable man of moments before disappearing beneath the warrior's mask. "Are they hostile?" "Unclear," Bjorn replied. "They are armed for war, but they have not attacked our scouts. They are requesting parley under peace terms." "Could be a trap," Ragnar said, already moving toward the door. He paused at the threshold, looking back at Astrid. "Stay here. Stay safe. We will speak more later, if the gods allow it." Then he was gone, striding across the settlement toward the main gates with Bjorn at his side. Astrid stood frozen for a moment, torn between the desire to follow and the knowledge that she would only be in the way. Thora returned, having clearly been hovering nearby, and placed a gentle hand on Astrid's shoulder. "Come," the healer said. "We can watch from the walls and still be ready if we are needed." They climbed to the wooden walkway that ran along the inside of the settlement's defensive wall, joining several other women who had the same idea. From this vantage point, Astrid could see Ragnar and his warriors assembled at the gates, armed and ready, but not in offensive formation. Beyond the walls, visible through the narrow pass that led to the valley, the approaching party had stopped, maintaining a respectful distance. A single rider separated from the group, bearing a branch of pine to signal peaceful intent. As the rider drew closer, Astrid felt her stomach drop. Even at this distance, she recognized the colors of her father's household, the distinctive pattern of the shield. The rider was Aldwin, one of her father's most trusted warriors, a man she had known since childhood. Ragnar stepped forward to meet him, and though Astrid could not hear the words exchanged, she could see the tension in both men's postures. The conversation lasted several minutes, with Aldwin gesturing frequently back toward his party, Ragnar standing rigid and still. Finally, Ragnar nodded once, and Aldwin returned to his men. The entire party approached the settlement gates slowly, weapons sheathed but clearly ready. Ragnar ordered the gates opened, and the visitors entered the valley, though his own warriors remained on high alert, hands never far from sword hilts. As the party dismounted in the settlement's central area, Astrid finally got a clear look at their leader. It was not her father, as she had half feared and half hoped, but rather a man she did not recognize. He was perhaps 40 winters, tall and well-built, with dark hair shot through with silver and eyes that scanned the settlement with keen intelligence. He wore fine clothes beneath his traveling cloak, and his weapons were of superior quality, marking him as a man of wealth and status. "I am Gunnar Thorvaldsson," the man announced in a carrying voice, "Jarl of the coastal territories of Nordvik. I come seeking Ragnar Eriksson with a proposal that may benefit us both." Ragnar stepped forward, his expression wary. "I am Ragnar. Speak your proposal, Jarl Gunnar, though I wonder why a coastal Jarl would travel so far into the mountains to find an exiled warrior." Gunnar smiled, though it did not quite reach his eyes. "Because exiled warriors who lead loyal men and maintain hidden strongholds have value, Ragnar Eriksson, and because I find myself in need of exactly that kind of value." He glanced around the settlement, his assessment appreciative. "You have built something impressive here. A true community, not just a raider's camp. It speaks well of your leadership. You did not travel this far to compliment my building skills," Ragnar said flatly. "What do you want?" "Direct. I appreciate that." Gunnar gestured to one of his men, who produced a rolled parchment. "I have a problem, Ragnar. A rival Jarl, Magnus Ironside, has been systematically attacking my coastal settlements, raiding my ships, killing my people. He wants my territories, my trade routes, my power. I have fought him for 2 years now, and we are at a stalemate. He has more warriors, but my position is defensible. What I need is an advantage, something to tip the balance." "And you think I can provide that advantage?" Ragnar said, understanding dawning in his voice. "I know you can," Gunnar replied. Your reputation as a warrior and tactician is well known, despite your exile. I am offering you and your men a contract. Fight for me in this conflict. Help me defeat Magnus Ironside. In return, I will pay you well in silver and supplies. And more importantly, I will petition the regional council to lift your exile, to restore your honor and position. The settlement fell utterly silent. Every person within hearing distance had stopped to listen, understanding that this offer could change everything. Ragnar's exile lifted, his honor restored, the ability to return to civilized lands, to reclaim what had been taken from him. It was more than just silver and supplies. It was the possibility of a different future. Ragnar stood motionless for what felt like an eternity. Astrid watched him from the wall, saw the conflict playing across his features, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Finally, he spoke. I need to consult with my men. You and your party may make camp outside the settlement walls. I will give you my answer by nightfall. Gunnar nodded, seeming to have expected this response. That is fair. I will await your decision. He and his men remounted and rode back through the gates to establish their camp beyond the walls. As soon as they were gone, Ragnar called his senior warriors to the great hall. Astrid climbed down from the wall, uncertainty churning in her stomach. This offer could mean freedom for Ragnar, for all his men who had followed him into exile. But it also meant war, meant leaving this valley, meant risking everything they had built here. She returned to the healer's house, but her mind was not on the work. Through the afternoon, she ground herbs mechanically, her thoughts circling endlessly around the implications of Gunnar's proposal. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the mountain peaks, she could stand it no longer. She cleaned her hands, removed her work apron, and walked to the great hall. The doors were closed, but she could hear raised voices within, debate and argument. She hesitated, knowing she had no right to intrude on council matters, that she was still an outsider in many ways despite the past weeks. But this decision would affect her life as surely as it would affect theirs, and she found she could not simply wait passively for others to determine her fate. She had done that once, with her father, and look where it had led her. Astrid pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside. The conversation stopped abruptly, all eyes turning to her. Ragnar sat in his chair at the head of the hall, surrounded by his warriors. His expression was unreadable as he looked at her, but he did not order her to leave. Forgive the intrusion, Astrid said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the weight of all those eyes upon her. But I heard Jarl Gunnar's offer, and I believe I may have information relevant to your decision. Ragnar leaned forward slightly. Speak. Gunnar Thorvaldsson is known to my father, Astrid said, moving further into the hall. They had dealings several years ago regarding trade routes. My father spoke of him sometimes, usually with grudging respect. Gunnar is cunning, ambitious, but he honors his agreements. If he says he will petition for your exile to be lifted, he will do so. He values his reputation for keeping his word too highly to risk it with deception. And Magnus Ironside? Ragnar asked. Do you know anything of him? Astrid nodded. Less directly, but yes. He was allied with Thorgir Ironhand at one time. The Jarl my father wanted me to marry. They are cut from the same cloth, men who believe might makes right, who care nothing for the suffering they cause in pursuit of power. If Gunnar is fighting against Magnus, then Gunnar has the more just cause, at least relatively speaking. Orm spoke up from his position near Ragnar. The girl makes good points, and we were already leaning toward accepting the offer. The silver alone would see us through 3 winters comfortably. The chance to lift the exile, to clear Ragnar's name, that is worth fighting for. It is also worth dying for, another warrior, Torsten, interjected. We have peace here, safety, a life we have built with our own hands. Why risk that for a Jarl we do not know, in a conflict that is not ours? Because this is not truly peace, Ragnar said quietly, and everyone turned to look at him. This is hiding. We have built something good here, yes, but we are still exiles, still fugitives from unjust accusations. Our children will grow up knowing they are outcasts, that they can never leave this valley without risk. Is that the legacy we want to leave them? Or do we fight for the chance to reclaim our place in the world? The hall was silent as the men absorbed his words. Then Bjorn stood, his young face determined. I say we fight, not just for the silver or even for lifting the exile, but because it is what we do. We are warriors, and sitting idle in safety while others fight for justice goes against everything we are. One by one, the other warriors voiced their agreement. Not all were enthusiastic, some clearly had reservations, but the consensus emerged. They would accept Gunnar's offer, would ride to war against Magnus Ironside, would stake everything on the chance for redemption and restoration. Ragnar looked around at his men, then his gaze settled on Astrid. "You will remain here," he said firmly. "The settlement will be left with enough warriors to defend it, and the women and children will be safe. I will not ask you to follow me into battle when you have already been forced into so much you did not choose." Astrid felt something fierce rise in her chest, a rebellion against being left behind again, being protected and sheltered as if she were fragile porcelain rather than a living woman with will and strength of her own. "No," she said, the word coming out stronger than she intended. Ragnar's eyebrows rose. "No, I will not remain here while you ride to war," Astrid said, moving to stand directly before him. "I am your wife, Ragnar, in the eyes of gods and men. Where you go, I go. If you fall in battle, I should be there. If you triumph, I should witness it. I will not be left behind like a child to be kept safe while others face the dangers." The great hall erupted in murmurs and exclamations at Astrid's declaration. Some of the warriors looked shocked, others intrigued, a few openly skeptical. Ragnar stood slowly, his full height and presence commanding immediate silence. He stepped down from the raised platform where his chair sat and moved to stand directly before Astrid, so close she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "You understand what you are asking," he said, his voice low and intense. "War is not some distant concept to be discussed in safety. It is blood and screaming, death and suffering, chaos and terror. I have seen strong men break under it, experienced warriors freeze when the reality of battle overtakes them. You have never held a weapon in anger, never seen a man die violently before your eyes." "No," Astrid admitted, refusing to look away despite the intensity of his gaze. "I have not, but I have seen death. I held my mother's hand as fever took her, watched her suffer for 3 days before the end finally came. I have endured my father's violence, his cruelty, his systematic destruction of everything that made me feel human. I am not some delicate flower that will wilt at the first sign of hardship, Ragnar. I am stronger than you think, stronger than I knew myself to be before all this began." Ragnar's expression shifted, something like admiration flickering in his storm-gray eyes. "I do not doubt your strength, Astrid, but strength of spirit and readiness for war are different things. If you come with us, you will see things that cannot be unseen, experience horrors that will live in your dreams for years. I am trying to protect you from that." "I do not want your protection," Astrid said fiercely. "I want your partnership. I want to stand beside you, not behind you. If this war succeeds, if your exile is lifted, then we will face a future together, whether we will it or not. I would rather face that future as someone who shared in the struggle than as someone who waited passively while others determined my fate." The silence in the hall was absolute, every warrior watching this exchange with rapt attention. Freya had entered at some point and stood near the door, her scarred face showing approval. Finally, Orm spoke up, his gruff voice carrying clearly. "Let her come," he said, and several heads turned in surprise. Not to fight, obviously, but to tend the wounded, to help maintain the camp, to do what she has been doing here these past weeks. We will need healers, cooks, people to manage supplies. Thora cannot do it all alone. And the girl is right about one thing. She is Ragnar's wife. Her place is with him for good or ill. Ragnar looked at his second in command, then back at Astrid. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the desire to keep her safe warring with understanding of her argument, perhaps even respect for her courage in making it. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. "You may come, but you will stay with the supply camp, well back from the fighting. You will work with Thora and the other healers, and you will follow orders without question or argument. If I say run, you run. If I say hide, you hide. Agreed?" "Agreed," Astrid said immediately, relief flooding through her. Ragnar turned to address the entire hall. "We accept Jarl Gunnar's offer. We leave in 3 days. Every man who is able will come, leaving only those necessary to defend the settlement in our absence. We fight for silver, for honor, and for the chance to reclaim what was unjustly taken from us. Make your preparations." The hall erupted in activity as warriors began discussing logistics, weapons, supplies. Ragnar sent Bjorn to inform Gunnar of their decision, then turned back to Astrid. His expression was softer now, the harsh warrior's mask slipping to reveal the complicated man beneath. "Come with me," he said quietly, gesturing toward their shared chamber. Astrid followed, her heart pounding, unsure what this private conversation might bring. Inside the chamber, away from the eyes and ears of the settlement, Ragnar seemed to struggle with what to say. He paced the small space once, twice, then stopped and faced her directly. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why insist on coming when you could stay here in safety? You owe me nothing, Astrid. This marriage was forced upon us both. You have no obligation to follow me into danger." Astrid moved to sit on the edge of the bed, gathering her thoughts before responding. "When my father told me I would marry you, I believed my life was over. I believed I was being sent to my death, or worse. But these past weeks have shown me something different. You are not the monster I was told you were. This settlement, these people, they are building something real, something worthy. And you, Ragnar, you are a better man than my father ever was, despite all his position and wealth and respectability." She paused, making sure he was truly listening. "I insist on coming because for the first time in my life, I feel like I have some measure of control over my own fate. Not complete control, perhaps, but more than I have ever had. You gave me that by not forcing yourself upon me, by treating me with basic decency and respect. I will not squander that gift by hiding in safety while you risk everything for a chance at redemption." Ragnar sat down on the bench across from her, his large frame somehow looking weary despite his obvious physical strength. "I have not been a proper husband to you. I have kept you at distance, treated you like a stranger. That was unfair. You have been grieving," Astrid said softly. "For 8 years you have been grieving Ingrid and your son, grieving your lost home and honor, grieving the man you might have been if fate had been kinder. I do not blame you for needing distance. I am a reminder of everything that was taken from you, a wife you did not choose bound to you by circumstances you did not want." "No," Ragnar said firmly, surprising her with his vehemence. "You are not a reminder of loss. You are—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "You are a reminder that life continues even after great pain, that there can be new beginnings even when we think all hope is gone. I have been afraid to acknowledge that, afraid to let you become real to me, because if you become real, then I might care what happens to you. And caring means the possibility of loss, of grief, of pain that I swore I would never allow myself to feel again." Astrid felt tears prick her eyes at his honesty, at the raw vulnerability in his voice. "I am afraid too," she admitted. "Afraid of this war we are riding toward, afraid of what might happen, afraid that I will prove too weak for what is coming. But I am more afraid of living my entire life in fear, of never taking risks, of never choosing my own path even when that path is dangerous." Ragnar stood and crossed the small distance between them, kneeling before her so they were at eye level. This close, she could see the silver strands threading through his dark hair, could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years of hardship and sorrow. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in his much larger one. "Then we will face this together," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "As true partners, not just strangers bound by vows. I cannot promise that I will be easy to live with, that I will not struggle with the ghosts of my past, but I can promise that I will try, that I will see you as you are, rather than as an obligation I never wanted." Astrid turned her hand to grip his, feeling the calluses and scars on his palm, the strength in his fingers. "That is all I ask, to be seen, to be acknowledged, to have some small say in what my life becomes. The rest we can figure out as we go." They remained like that for a long moment, hands clasped, eyes locked, an understanding passing between them that went deeper than words. Finally Ragnar stood, pulling her gently to her feet. "It grows late," he said. "We should rest. Tomorrow begins the preparations, and there is much to do before we ride out." That night, for the first time since their wedding, they slept side by side with less distance between them, no longer strangers but not yet truly intimate, somewhere in the careful space between. Astrid lay awake long after Ragnar's breathing had deepened into sleep, thinking about what lay ahead, about the battle to come and the uncertain future beyond it. The next 3 days passed in a blur of frantic activity. The entire settlement mobilized to prepare for the coming campaign. Weapons were sharpened and repaired, armor was checked and mended, supplies were gathered and packed. The women worked alongside the men, understanding that success in this venture meant the possibility of a better future for all of them. Astrid found herself working closely with Thora, learning more about herbs and healing, about how to treat sword wounds and arrow injuries, how to set broken bones and stitch torn flesh. The healer was a patient teacher, though her lessons were grimly practical, focused on keeping men alive in the chaos of battle, rather than on gentle healing in peaceful circumstances. "You have good hands," Thora told her on the second day, as Astrid practiced stitching on a piece of leather. "Steady and sure. That will serve you well when the wounded start coming in. But remember, child, not every man can be saved. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is ease their passing rather than prolong their suffering. That is the hardest lesson of all." Astrid absorbed these teachings with a mix of determination and dread. The reality of what she had insisted upon was becoming clearer with each passing hour, the abstract concept of war transforming into concrete preparations for violence and death. But she did not waver, did not allow herself to reconsider. She had made her choice, and she would see it through. On the evening before their departure, Ragnar called the entire settlement together for a feast and ceremony. It was both a farewell for those leaving and a blessing for those staying behind to defend the valley. The great hall was filled to capacity, firelight dancing off weapons and faces, the air thick with smoke and anticipation. Ragnar stood before them all, his presence commanding absolute attention. "Tomorrow we ride to war," he began, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "We ride for silver and supplies, yes, but we ride for more than that. We ride for honor, for justice, for the chance to prove that exile does not define us, that accusations without merit cannot destroy what we have built through our own strength and courage." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. "Some of us may not return. That is the nature of battle, the price we pay for taking up arms. But know this, every man who falls will fall with honor, defending a cause worth fighting for, and every man who survives will return to a home made more secure by our victory, to families who can live without fear, to a future brighter than our past." The hall erupted in cheers and the clashing of weapons against shields, a thunder of approval and determination. Astrid watched Ragnar's face and saw pride there, love for these people who had followed him into exile and uncertainty, fierce determination to lead them to something better. Later that night, as the festivities began to wind down and people drifted toward their beds, Ragnar and Astrid returned to their chamber. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of their journey to the coast, to Jarl Gunnar's territories and the war waiting there. Tonight was perhaps their last moment of peace, their last chance to speak freely before chaos descended. Ragnar stood at the chamber's small window, looking out at the settlement bathed in moonlight. "I want you to know," he said without turning around, "that if something happens to me in this battle, you will be provided for. Orm has instructions to see you safely back here, to ensure you have a place in the settlement for as long as you wish it. You will not be cast out or left vulnerable. Nothing is going to happen to you," Astrid said firmly, moving to stand beside him at the window. "You are too stubborn to die, too strong to fall." He turned to look at her then, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I was wrong about you," he said softly. "When your father first came to me with his offer, I thought you would be another sheltered Jarl's daughter, useless beyond your beauty, a burden I would have to carry. But you are fierce, Astrid. You are brave and strong and more capable than you give yourself credit for. I am proud to call you my wife." The words settled over Astrid like a warm cloak on a cold night, filling some hollow place inside her that she had not fully acknowledged was empty. "And I am learning that being your wife might not be the punishment my father intended it to be, that perhaps given time and shared struggle it might become something worth having." Ragnar reached out and gently tucked a strand of her honey gold hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin. "When this is over, when the battle is won and my honor restored, I would like to try being a proper husband to you. Not forcing anything, not rushing, but trying, learning who you are, letting you learn who I am, building something real between us." "I would like that too," Astrid whispered, her heart pounding at his closeness, at the promise implicit in his words. They stood together at the window for a long while, watching the moon track across the sky. neither quite willing to break the fragile intimacy of the moment. Finally, exhaustion claimed them both, and they lay down to sleep, this time with Ragnar's arm around her waist, her head resting on his shoulder, two people beginning to find comfort in each other's presence. Dawn broke cold and clear over the mountain valley, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost mocking in their beauty given what the day would bring. Astrid woke to find Ragnar already up, strapping on his armor with practiced efficiency. The leather and iron pieces transformed him from the man who had held her through the night into the warrior the world knew as the Ruthless, and she felt a pang of something like loss at the change. "Help me with this," he said, gesturing to a particularly difficult buckle at his shoulder. Astrid rose quickly, still wearing her shift, and moved to assist him. Her fingers worked the straps and buckles, learning the geography of his armor, understanding how each piece fit together to protect the man beneath. "Promise me something," she said as she secured the last buckle. "Promise me you will come back, that you will not throw your life away in some grand gesture of honor or revenge. Promise me you will fight to win, to survive, to return here." Ragnar turned to face her, his hands coming up to cup her face gently. "I promise I will do everything in my power to return to you. But Astrid, you must promise me the same. If the battle turns against us, if you are given the chance to flee, you take it. You do not wait for me. You do not try to be heroic. You survive, no matter what that requires. Can you promise me that?" Astrid wanted to argue, to insist she would never abandon him, but she saw the desperate need in his eyes and understood. He needed to know she would be safe, would survive even if he fell. It was the same need that had driven her demand to accompany him in the first place. The need to have some measure of control over fate in a world that so often allowed none. "I promise," she said, rising on her toes to press her forehead against his. "I will survive. I will live. For both of us, if necessary." They stood like that for a long moment, breathing together, drawing strength from each other. Then the sounds of the settlement stirring to full wakefulness intruded, and the moment passed. Ragnar stepped back, his expression shifting back to the controlled mask of leadership. "Get dressed," he said. "We leave within the hour." The departure was organized chaos. Warriors mounting horses, supply wagons being loaded, final instructions being given to those staying behind to guard the settlement. Freya embraced Astrid tightly, whispering fierce encouragement in her ear. Sina pressed a small carved wooden charm into her hand, claiming it would bring luck. Even Grim Orm gave her a nod that might have been approval or simply acknowledgement. The journey to the coast took 12 days of hard travel. They moved swiftly, stopping only when absolutely necessary, driven by the urgency of Jarl Gunnar's situation. The coastal Jarl's men rode with them, and gradually the two groups began to merge, warriors sharing stories and strategies around campfires, building the camaraderie that would be essential in battle. Gunnar himself rode near Ragnar much of the time, discussing tactics and plans. Astrid, riding nearby, could not help but listen, absorbing information about their enemy Magnus Ironside. He commanded nearly 200 warriors, held 3 fortified settlements along the coast, and had ships that could strike quickly and retreat before significant defense could be mounted. It was a daunting opposition, and Gunnar's frank assessment of their chances was sobering at best. "With your men added to mine, we have perhaps 150 warriors," Gunnar said on the 8th day of travel. "Still outnumbered, but your reputation alone may be worth 20 men in terms of fear and hesitation. Magnus has heard of Ragnar the Ruthless. He will not be eager to face you in open combat." "Then we ensure he has no choice," Ragnar replied. "We force him to meet us on ground of our choosing, in circumstances that favor our smaller numbers. A fortified settlement is difficult to take, but it can also become a trap if the defenders cannot retreat." As they drew closer to the coast, evidence of the conflict became visible. They passed burned farmsteads, abandoned villages, people huddled in makeshift camps who watched the armed party pass with expressions of desperate hope mixed with fear. This was what war did to the innocent, Astrid realized, her stomach churning. It destroyed lives far beyond those who actually fought, rippling out to touch everyone in its path. They reached Gunnar's primary settlement on the 12th day, a substantial fortified town built on a natural harbor. Ships bobbed in the protected waters, and the walls were thick and high, clearly built to withstand sieges. The people greeted their Jarl's return with relief and celebration, though the mood was tempered by the knowledge of what was coming. Ragnar immediately began organizing the defenses and planning the offensive. He walked the walls with Gunnar and the senior warriors, assessing sight lines and weak points. He inspected the ships, understanding how they might be used not just for escape, but as mobile fighting platforms. He drilled the combined forces relentlessly, forging Gunnar's men and his own into a cohesive unit. Astrid, meanwhile, established the healing station with Thora in a longhouse near the main hall. They organized supplies, prepared spaces for the wounded, trained several of Gunnar's household women in basic healing techniques. The work kept her hands busy but could not quiet her mind, could not stop the growing dread as reports came in of Magnus's forces massing for a final assault. On the 5th night after their arrival, scouts reported that Magnus Ironside was moving his entire force toward Gunnar's settlement. He was done with small raids and skirmishes. This would be the decisive battle, winner take all. The settlement erupted in frantic final preparations, every able-bodied person contributing to the defense. Ragnar found Astrid in the healing house late that night, checking supplies one final time. He looked exhausted, the weight of command pressing down on his broad shoulders. But when he saw her, some of the tension eased from his face. "Tomorrow it begins," he said simply. "Magnus will be here by midday. We will meet him outside the walls, on the beach where our ships can support us, and his numbers will be less advantageous. It will be brutal and bloody, but I believe we can win." Astrid set down the bandages she had been counting and moved to him, taking his hands in hers. "You will win. You must win. Too much depends on it." Ragnar pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that felt desperate, final. "If I fall tomorrow, know that these past weeks have been unexpected, good, in ways I did not think I would ever experience again. You have reminded me what it means to hope for something more than simple survival." "You will not fall," Astrid said fiercely against his chest. "I will not allow it. The gods themselves will have to go through me to take you." He laughed, a rough sound but genuine. "Fierce little warrior, what did I do to deserve you? You treated me like a human being instead of property," Astrid said, pulling back to look up at his face. "You gave me choices when you could have taken them away. You showed me that strength and gentleness can exist in the same person. That is more than deserving, Ragnar. That is rare and precious." He bent his head and kissed her then, the first kiss they had shared since their wedding day. It was gentle but intense, filled with all the words they had not yet spoken, all the feelings they were only beginning to acknowledge. When they finally parted, both were breathing hard, and Astrid felt as though the world had shifted on its axis. "When this is over," Ragnar said, his voice rough with emotion, "when the battle is won and my honor restored, I want to truly begin our life together, not as strangers bound by obligation, but as partners who choose each other every day. Will you have me, Astrid? Not because you must, but because you want to." "Yes," Astrid whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, I will have you. I choose you, Ragnar. I choose this life we might build together." They spent that night wrapped in each other's arms, not making love but simply holding each other, drawing comfort and strength from shared warmth and whispered hopes for the future. As dawn approached, Ragnar reluctantly disentangled himself and began donning his armor once more. Astrid helped him, her hands steadier now than they had been 12 days ago, familiar with the buckles and straps. She checked each piece carefully, making sure everything was secure, that no weak point existed that might allow a blade through. When he was fully armored, she stood back and looked at him. This man who had become so much more than the monster of legend, who had shown her kindness and respect when the world had shown her neither. "Come back to me," she said one last time. "I will," he promised, touching her face gently with one armored hand. "I have too much to live for now to throw my life away carelessly." The battle began as the sun reached its zenith. Magnus Ironside's forces swept down onto the beach in a disciplined formation, shields locked, weapons ready, a wall of iron and determination. Gunnar and Ragnar's combined forces met them with equal resolve, and the clash when the two shield walls collided was like thunder, deafening and terrible. From the healing house, Astrid could hear the sounds of combat, the screaming of wounded men, the clash of weapons, the shouted orders and battle cries. She and Thora stood ready with their supplies, along with a dozen other women prepared to help. The waiting was agony, every instinct screaming at her to run to the battle to see what was happening, to know if Ragnar still lived. The first wounded began arriving within minutes. Men with sword cuts and spear wounds, some walking on their own, others carried by their brothers in arms. Astrid forced herself to focus, to remember everything Thora had taught her. She cleaned wounds, applied pressure to stop bleeding, stitched torn flesh with steady hands that belied her internal terror. The blood was overwhelming, the pain and screaming almost more than she could bear, but she worked on mechanically, saving what lives she could. Hours passed in a blur of gore and suffering. The tide of wounded seemed endless, a testament to the ferocity of the fighting. Thora worked beside her tirelessly, calling out instructions, moving between patients with practiced efficiency. Some men they saved, binding their wounds and sending them to rest. Others they could only ease toward death, offering water and gentle words as life drained away. As afternoon began to fade toward evening, the sounds of battle changed. The clash of weapons grew less constant, the shouting more sporadic. Then finally a roar of victory rose from the beach, and Astrid's heart leaped with desperate hope. Bjorn burst into the healing house, covered in blood and dirt but grinning fiercely. "We won! Magnus is dead, his forces scattered or surrendered." "The chief—" He paused, seeing Astrid's desperate expression. "The chief lives. He is wounded but not seriously. He asks for you." Astrid did not wait to hear more. She ran from the healing house, heedless of the blood staining her dress, heedless of propriety or dignity. She ran through the settlement gates and down to the beach where bodies littered the sand, where victorious warriors were tending their wounded brothers, where the evidence of brutal combat was everywhere. She found Ragnar surrounded by men, being helped out of his armor. Blood soaked his left side, and she could see the gash in his armor where a blade had penetrated. Her heart stopped until she saw him standing upright under his own power, saw him giving orders with his usual authority despite the wound. "Ragnar," she called, and he turned at the sound of her voice. His face transformed when he saw her, the controlled warrior's expression giving way to pure relief and joy. He pushed away the men trying to help him and moved toward her, meeting her halfway. They collided in an embrace that ignored the blood and dirt and watching eyes, holding each other with desperate intensity. "You came back," Astrid sobbed against his chest. "You promised and you came back." "I promised," Ragnar said, his voice rough and exhausted but triumphant. "And I always keep my promises to you." They stood like that for long minutes, neither willing to let go, until finally Thora's stern voice cut through. "Touching as this is, that wound needs tending before infection sets in. Get him to the healing house now." Ragnar allowed himself to be led away, though he kept Astrid's hand firmly clasped in his own, refusing to release her. In the healing house, Thora cleaned and stitched the wound with practiced efficiency, while Astrid held his other hand, offering what comfort she could. "It is not deep," Thora pronounced finally. "The armor deflected most of the blow. You will be stiff and sore for weeks, but you will live to fight another day, you stubborn man." Ragnar grinned despite the pain. "I had reason to ensure I survived this day. A promise to keep, a future to claim." Over the following days, the full scope of their victory became clear. Magnus Ironside had fallen in personal combat with Ragnar, a fight that witnesses described in awed tones. With their leader dead, Magnus's forces had quickly surrendered or fled, leaving Gunnar in undisputed control of the coastal territories. The Jarl was effusive in his gratitude and praise, insisting on holding a grand feast to celebrate their triumph. But more importantly, Gunnar made good on his promise. He sent messengers to the regional council, petitioning for Ragnar's exile to be lifted, presenting evidence of the unjust accusations that had led to his banishment. Gunnar's testimony, combined with Ragnar's reputation earned through this victory, carried significant weight. 3 weeks after the battle, the response came. The regional council, swayed by Gunnar's advocacy and impressed by Ragnar's conduct, declared the exile lifted. The accusations of theft were formally dismissed as baseless, and Ragnar Eriksson was restored to full honor and rights as a free warrior of standing. He could return to civilized lands, could reclaim his birthright if he wished, could walk without fear of arrest or attack based on his father's condemnation. The news was received with jubilation by Ragnar's men, many of whom had followed him into exile and now saw their loyalty rewarded with restoration of their own honor and freedom. A feast was held that night that rivaled any Astrid had ever attended in her father's hall, with flowing mead and roasted meat, with songs and stories celebrating their victory and their vindication. Ragnar pulled Astrid aside during the festivities, leading her away from the noise and celebration to a quiet spot on the settlement walls where they could look out over the harbor, moonlight painting the waves in silver. "We have choices now," he said, taking both her hands in his. "Real choices, not forced upon us by circumstance. I could return to my father's lands, could confront Helga's lies and reclaim my position, or I could remain at our mountain settlement, continue building what we have started there, or we could forge an entirely new path, establish ourselves here on the coast with Gunnar's support, build something different from either my past or our present." Astrid looked up at him, at this man who had become so precious to her over these weeks of shared struggle and growing understanding. "What do you want, Ragnar? Not what duty demands, not what others need, but what you want for yourself." He was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I want to build a life worth living with a woman I am learning to love. I want to create something lasting, something that will outlive us both. I want to wake each morning without the weight of exile and shame, to sleep each night knowing I am where I choose to be rather than where I was forced to go." "Then let us return to the mountain settlement," Astrid said firmly. "Not as exiles hiding from the world, but as free people choosing to build something meaningful in a place we have claimed as our own. We can expand it, welcome others who seek a fresh start, create a true community where honor matters more than birth, where people are valued for their contributions rather than their connections." Ragnar smiled, and it transformed his scarred face, made him look younger, lighter, happier than she had ever seen him. "You would choose the mountain valley over comfort here on the coast, over the possibility of fine halls and servants and the life you were born to?" "I would choose wherever you are," Astrid said honestly. "I would choose a life we build together over any comfort or status. The mountain valley is our home, Ragnar. The people there are our family. That is worth more than all the fine halls in Norway." He pulled her close, kissing her with a passion that had been building between them for weeks, no longer restrained by uncertainty or fear. When they finally parted, both were breathless, and Astrid felt heat flood through her that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with desire. "When we return home," Ragnar said, his voice rough with emotion and want, "I would like to be your husband in truth, not just in name. If you are willing, if you want that." "I am willing," Astrid whispered, her heart racing. "I want that. I want you. I want the life we can build together." They remained on the wall long into the night, talking about their plans, their dreams, the future that stretched before them bright with possibility. For the first time in either of their lives, they felt truly free, free from exile, free from forced obligations, free to choose each other, not from necessity, but from genuine desire and growing love. The return journey to the mountain valley took 2 weeks, the pace more leisurely than their desperate rush to the coast. Ragnar's wound healed cleanly, and his spirits were higher than anyone had seen in years. The warriors who rode with them spoke excitedly about returning home, about the welcome they would receive, about the future they could now build without the shadow of exile hanging over them. Gunnar had been generous in his parting gifts, silver enough to sustain the settlement for years, supplies aplenty, and a standing offer of alliance and trade. More than that, he had given them back their honor, their freedom, their rightful place in the world. As they crested the final mountain pass and saw their valley spread out below, Astrid felt tears spring to her eyes. It looked more beautiful than she remembered, the long houses clustered beside the blue lake, smoke rising from hearth fires, tiny figures moving between buildings as life continued in their absence. This was home, truly home, in a way her father's hall had never been. The settlement erupted in celebration when they arrived, everyone pouring out to greet the returning warriors, to embrace loved ones, to hear stories of the battle and the victory. Freya swept Astrid into a fierce hug, whispering that she looked different, happier, more alive than when she had left. That night, there was another feast, this one tinged with the joy of homecoming and the relief of survival. Ragnar stood before his people and told them of the victory, of the lifting of exile, of the choices that now lay before them. "We are free," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Free to leave if we wish, to return to the lands we came from, to rejoin families and reclaim positions. But I believe, that many of you will choose to remain here. To continue building this community we have created, making it even stronger now that we no longer operate from a position of desperation, but from one of choice and strength. To a person, every warrior, every woman, every child in that hall pledged to remain, to continue building their home together. It was a moment of pure unity, of shared commitment to something larger than any individual. Later, much later, Ragnar and Astrid returned to their chamber. The space felt different now, no longer a place where strangers maintained careful distance, but a room that belonged to two people building a life together. Ragnar closed the door behind them, and for the first time, there was no awkwardness, no uncertainty, only anticipation and desire born of genuine affection and growing love. "Are you certain?" Ragnar asked one final time, giving her the choice even now. "We need not rush this if you are not ready." Astrid reached up and began unfastening the clasps on his tunic, her fingers steady and sure. "I have never been more certain of anything. I choose this. I choose you. I choose the life we will build together." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and the careful distance they had maintained for so long finally dissolved completely. They came together with tenderness and passion, two people who had found each other through the most unlikely of circumstances, who had chosen to transform an arranged marriage of punishment into something real and precious. As dawn broke over the mountain valley, Astrid woke in Ragnar's arms, feeling truly content for the first time in her life. She had been forced to marry the most feared Viking warrior as her father's punishment, had expected nothing but suffering from the arrangement. Instead, she had found strength she did not know she possessed, had discovered purpose and belonging, and most unexpectedly of all, she had found love. Ragnar stirred beside her, his arms tightening around her waist. "Good morning, wife," he murmured against her hair. "Good morning, husband," Astrid replied, smiling at the words that once had filled her with dread, but now brought only joy. "What shall we do today?" Ragnar asked, though his tone suggested he had some ideas of his own. Astrid laughed, turning in his arms to face him. "Today we begin truly living. We build, we love, we create the future we choose for ourselves. Together." "Together," Ragnar agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss. Outside their chamber, the settlement was waking to a new day, a new future bright with possibility. The exile had been lifted, honor had been restored, and two people who had been forced together by cruelty and punishment had found in each other something worth far more than silver or status. They had found love, partnership, and the freedom to choose their own path forward. In the years that followed, their mountain settlement grew and prospered. Ragnar proved to be a wise and fair leader, attracting others who sought a place where honor and hard work mattered more than birth and connections. Astrid became known throughout the region for her healing skills and her fierce dedication to the community, a Jarl's daughter who had chosen to build something meaningful rather than rest on privilege. They had children, 3 strong sons and 2 clever daughters, who grew up knowing they were loved and valued. Ragnar told them stories of their mother's courage, how she had insisted on accompanying him to war, how she had stood beside him when she could have chosen safety. Astrid told them of their father's honor, how he had treated her with respect when he could have claimed her by force, how he had built a community based on loyalty and justice. Their marriage, born of punishment and spite, became a legend of a different sort, a story of how love could grow even in the most unlikely soil, how two people forced together by others' cruelty could choose to create something beautiful and lasting. And every night, as they lay together in the chamber they shared, Ragnar would thank the gods for the unexpected gift that had come from his exile, for the fierce woman who had been thrust into his life and had transformed it completely. And Astrid would smile, knowing that her father's intended punishment had become her greatest blessing, that the man everyone feared had shown her what it meant to be truly loved and valued. Together, they had built a life worth living, a love worth fighting for, and a legacy that would outlast them both. And it had all begun with the words that once had filled Astrid with terror, but now filled her heart with joy. She was forced to marry the most feared Viking warrior as her father's punishment, but he loved her.